They said she was broken. They said it at church potlucks, in hushed voices over casserole dishes. They said it at prayer circles, between amens, with sad eyes and shaking heads. They said it for 6 years. And she let them. Not because she was weak. Not because she didn't know the truth. But because she believed, the way some people believe in God, that if you just stay quiet long enough, the truth will always find its own way to the surface. She was wrong about the timeline. But she wasn't wrong about the truth. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom on a cold, bright morning that turned an entire town's story upside down, take 1 second right now and hit subscribe. Because this is the kind of story that will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. And you won't want to miss what comes next. Her name is Dr. Elena Graves. And the night this story begins, she had just finished a 12-hour shift in the emergency department of a mid-sized hospital in a small Ohio city where everybody's business is everybody's religion. She'd stitched strangers back together at 3 in the morning without her hands ever trembling. She'd told families the hardest news a human being can hear, and done it with steadiness and grace. She had held broken people together for years. She just didn't know that the whole time. She was the one everyone was quietly calling broken. It was a Thursday evening. The maternity ward was one corridor away from the ER, and Elena had cut through it 100 times without a second thought. But on this Thursday, Carol Whitmore was waiting. Carol was the kind of woman who smiled like a door closing. The kind whose kindness always had a point to it, sharp and hidden, like a pin tucked inside a handshake. She was the mother of Elena's ex-husband, Thomas. They'd finalized the divorce the previous year. Elena hadn't fought for much. She'd been too exhausted from fighting for her name. Carol saw her first. She walked right up, unhurried, deliberate, in her Sunday posture, even though it was a Thursday. And then she said it. Loud enough that the nurses nearby went still. Loud enough that the aide pushing a cart slowed her steps to listen. Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made. He has a baby boy now, with someone you used to call your best friend. 6 years of being labeled the broken one, the hollow one, the woman whose body had supposedly failed her marriage. 6 years, compressed into a single breath and aimed like an arrow. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't let a single tear form behind her eyes, though something tightened in her chest that would have brought most people to their knees. She just looked at Carol the way she looks at a flat line, calm, clinical, unafraid, and said, quietly, "Is that what you believe?" Carol blinked. She'd expected tears. She'd expected a trembling lip or a sharp retort. She got neither. What she got instead was silence. And then, from somewhere down the hallway, the automatic doors hissed open. And a man neither Carol nor Elena's former best friend had ever expected to see walk through them. That moment would take 5 minutes to fully arrive. But it had been 7 years in the making. Let me take you back to the beginning. Elena grew up in the kind of small town where the church newsletter travels faster than local news and everyone has a theory about everyone else's life. Her mother cleaned houses. Her father drove a feed truck until his back gave out. She worked 2 jobs through college and another 2 through medical school, and she carried every penny of that sacrifice quietly, the way people from towns like hers are taught to. She believed in doing good work and letting it speak. She believed that if you live honestly, the truth will protect you. She would spend 6 years learning how badly that belief could cost her. She married Thomas Whitmore at 28 years old. He was the kind of man strangers immediately liked. Warm handshake. Remembered every name. The sort of charm that makes a room feel chosen. Half the county thought the world of him. For a while, so did she. They wanted a family. And wanting it, for a long time, was the only thing that happened. 2 years in, Elena did what any doctor would do. She suggested they both get tested. Routine workup. Simple. Sensible. Thomas refused. At first, he laughed it off. Then he got quiet and sharp about it. He spoke about faith. About leaving things in God's hands. About how Whitmore men didn't have those kinds of problems. Elena pushed once. She pushed twice. Then she let it go, because you cannot drag a grown man into a clinic, and she went alone. Her results came back completely normal. She sat in her car in the clinic parking lot, reading the paper twice, feeling a strange mixture of relief and confusion. If it wasn't her, then what was it? She didn't have an answer. And the longer she went without one, the more quietly Thomas filled in the blank for the people around him. The first whisper was to his mother. Carol Whitmore ran the women's circle at her church the way a general runs a campaign. She'd raised Thomas alone after his father died young, and somewhere in those hard years, she'd decided her son was proof that the sacrifice had been worth it. He had to be perfect, because if he wasn't, what had she given everything for? So when Thomas leaned close one evening and said, barely above a murmur, that the trouble was probably Elena, probably something medical, Carol didn't pause to question it. She picked it up. And she ran. It started small. A sympathetic sigh at a potluck. A lowered voice over someone's elbow. Poor Thomas. He wanted children so badly. Then it grew sharper. At a church supper that fall, Carol introduced Elena to a visiting pastor's wife with a look of practiced, polished pity. This is Elena, she said, smiling. My daughter-in-law. She's a doctor, you know. A pause. Such a shame about the children. The visiting woman gave Elena a slow, sad nod, the kind that told her everything. The story had already arrived before she had. She stood in her good dress holding a paper plate, and Carol reached over and patted her hand. As if Elena were the one who needed comforting. Some women, Carol said, soft and certain, like a benediction, just aren't built for it. She believed it. That was the worst part. She wasn't cruel in the way that knows itself as cruelty. She was repeating what her son had handed her, polished, certain, and she had no idea the words were a lie wearing her own voice. Elena drove home and said nothing to Thomas. She was still waiting for the truth to sort itself out. Then there was Mara. Mara Callaway had been Elena's closest friend since they were 15. Since a high school chemistry class where they'd both gotten the same question wrong and laughed about it at the same moment. They'd stayed close through everything. 2 states. A dozen years. The death of Elena's father. The green dress Mara wore at Elena's wedding, crying through the vows. When the church talk started weighing on Elena, Mara was who she called. Mara always knew what to say. Or so Elena believed. Looking back, every comfort Mara offered had a hook in it. You're so accomplished, Elena. Maybe that's just not your path. Thomas adores you. Don't let his mother get in your head. You don't need a baby to be whole. Kind words, every one of them. But they always landed on the same bruise. They always reminded Elena of the thing she supposedly lacked. She didn't notice then how often Mara's eyes drifted to Thomas across a room. She didn't notice that Mara began knowing details about Thomas's schedule that Elena hadn't shared. She was too grateful for the company to count the cost. People like Mara don't take what's yours all at once. They borrow it piece by piece. Until one day you look up and it's gone. And they're standing in the middle of your life like they were always meant to be there. Thomas filed for divorce on a Tuesday. Elena came home from a 12-hour shift to find a manila envelope on the kitchen counter and his closet half empty. He didn't even wait to tell her himself. By the weekend, he'd moved into Mara's apartment across town, and the version of events that spread through the county was already written, already circulating, already believed by people who should have known better. Elena was cold. Elena was married to her job. Elena couldn't give him children. And a man wants a family, doesn't he? Carol made sure every pew heard it. Mara said nothing to correct it. The 2 people who had known Elena longest let her become a cautionary tale. And Elena, still believing that staying quiet was the decent thing to do, swallowed it. She went to work the next morning and set a teenager's broken arm and told him he'd be fine. And he was. And in that hour, inside that room that smelled of antiseptic and clean cotton, that was the only true thing in her world. Here is the thing about choosing silence when people are lying about you. The silence doesn't protect you. It protects them. For a while, Elena could absorb it, carry it like weather, the way people from small, hard towns learn to carry difficult things. The hospital was still hers. The trauma bay was still the place where nobody called her hollow. She was still the doctor who could run a code, read a scan, talk a frightened child through stitches, all without her pulse climbing. The work held her together when nothing else did. Until the lie followed her there, too. She had been in line for years to lead the emergency department. She had built the trauma protocols that half the county now ran on. The position was as good as hers, everyone knew it, including her, until the whispers found the credentialing committee. Not facts. There were no facts to find. Just the shape of a story. Dr. Graves's personal life is unstable. There are questions about her judgment. Did you hear about the divorce? About what the family says? One board member, a man who played golf with Thomas's uncle, began asking pointed questions about her ability to lead under pressure, as if she hadn't spent a decade holding herself together while people bled out on her table. The position went to someone with half her hours and none of her protocols. They told her she was a strong candidate. They told her it was a difficult decision. They did not tell her the real reason. But she had grown up in a small town. She knew the sound of a verdict dressed up as a compliment. She sat in her car in the hospital lot that night, the same way she'd sat years earlier reading her normal test results, and she felt something finally, quietly shift inside her. A lie about her body had cost her a marriage. She had endured that because she thought endurance was the decent thing. But now the same lie was reaching into the one place she had never let anyone touch. Her name. Her work. The thing she had bled for. A nurse she trusted gave her the name of an attorney. Her name was Ruth Callaway. Ruth's office was above a hardware store on a side street downtown. She had reading glasses pushed up into silver hair and a way of listening that felt like she was already 3 moves ahead. Elena sat down across from her and told her everything. The marriage, the church talk, the board, the job she had lost, without editing a single word. Ruth listened without interrupting, which lawyers rarely do. When Elena finished, Ruth set down her pen. What you're describing could be defamation, she said. Possibly false light. But I won't lie to you. It's hard to prove. She laid it out plainly. 3 things had to be established: a specific false statement, the spreading of that statement to others, and real, measurable harm. The harm part is solid, Ruth said. A lost promotion is a number. A salary gap is a number. That's the easy part. Elena turned her grandmother's watch around her wrist, a habit from childhood, something she did when she was waiting out something she couldn't yet change. And the false part? Ruth looked at her steadily over the rim of her glasses. That's the part you have to be willing to fight about in public. They'll say the statement is true. They'll say you really couldn't have children. To win, you'd need to be ready to prove it wasn't you. Elena felt her stomach drop. She almost stood up and left. Then Ruth said the thing she needed to hear. Silence isn't a virtue, Elena, when it's costing you your career. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is make them prove what they're saying. Elena spent 2 weeks weighing it. She wrote down everything she stood to lose, the church community she'd grown up in, her standing in a town that already half believed the worst, the way people would talk, calling her bitter, calling her vengeful, saying she was the kind of woman who sues out of spite. She knew exactly how that story would go, because they'd already written most of it. But then she wrote the other column. Her name. Her work. The truth. And the simple fact that she had done nothing wrong and was being punished for it anyway. This wouldn't be revenge, she decided. Revenge is loud and hungry and never satisfied. This would be the truth, said once, in a place where it counted. She called Ruth on a Monday morning before her shift. I'm in. Good, Ruth said. Then let's make them say it under oath. Elena hung up and walked into the trauma bay. She had the steadiest shift she'd had in a year. It turns out a made-up mind is its own kind of calm. The complaint was filed and the news moved through town faster than any ambulance. Thomas's mother was furious. The women's circle buzzed. Messages flooded in, some cruel, some curious, a few quietly supportive from women who had watched their own reputations get rewritten by people who claimed to love them. One message said simply, "Good for you. They did the same to my sister." Elena didn't respond to any of them. She just kept showing up for her shifts, and let the case move at the speed of the law. Which is to say, slowly. Ruth explained that the other side had 2 options. They could argue that the statements were just opinion, hurt feelings, nothing actionable. Survivable for them, but survivable. Or they could plant their flag and argue the statements were true. That Elena really was the reason there had been no children. That second road is the one I'm hoping they take, Ruth said. Elena asked why. Ruth smiled like someone who already knew the ending. Because then they have to prove it. And to prove it, they have to open a door. Thomas's lawyers took the second road. Their defense, filed in plain legal language, was that the statements about Elena were not defamation. Because they were true. The fault, they argued, was hers. Medical. Irrefutable. When Ruth called to tell her, Elena could hear something just beneath her steady voice, something close to quiet delight. They just said the magic words, Ruth said. Truth is a defense. But here's what they didn't think through. A beat of silence. To prove the statements are true, to prove the infertility was yours, they'd have to put both of your medical pictures in front of a court. And they just swore under oath that the cause was definitely you. Another beat. They can't make that claim and then refuse to let anyone look at him. Elena sat down slowly at her kitchen table. Meaning, Ruth said. They just put Thomas's own fertility in play. He spent years hiding behind it was her. By swearing to it in court, he may have handed us the reason to finally ask about him. For 6 years, Elena's body had been discussed at potlucks and prayer circles. And in trying to make that official, in trying to win by saying it out loud under oath, the Whitmores had done the one thing they'd spent years refusing to do. They'd opened the door to looking at Thomas. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She went back through the timeline the way she reads an old chart. Slow, careful, looking for the thing she missed the first time. And there it was. 7 years ago. Early in the marriage. Thomas had driven up to the city alone for what he called a routine physical. He'd been gone all day. He came home different. Quiet in a way that wasn't like him. Short-tempered over nothing. He'd poured himself a drink before dinner, which he never did on a weekday. She'd asked if everything was okay. He'd said the doctor was useless and the whole trip was a waste, and he'd changed the subject with such force it left a mark in the air between them. After that day, he never mentioned getting tested again. Not once. And in that same stretch of weeks, the first whispers about Elena began. She'd filed it away as a man being moody about a wasted afternoon. She hadn't been looking for a lie. You don't audit the people you love. But now, with Ruth's words still resting in her ears, that quiet day in the city looked less like a wasted trip and more like the moment something got decided. The next morning, Elena called Ruth. She told her where to point. Ruth filed the motion, and Thomas's lawyers fought it hard. Nobody fights that hard over nothing. They argued privacy. They argued relevance. They argued every angle available to them, grasping for anything that might keep a particular medical folder in a particular city archive permanently closed. The hearing was scheduled. Elena had to sit with not knowing, which for a woman who orders a test and expects an answer, is its own particular form of torture. She went back to her shifts. Set bones. Read scans. Talked frightened people through the worst nights of their lives. Ruth told her to be patient. Courts move slowly on purpose, she said. It gives the truth time to stop being scary. Elena wasn't scared of the truth. She was scared they'd find a way to keep her from it. The ruling came on a gray afternoon in the middle of a slow shift. Ruth called, and Elena stepped into the hospital supply closet to take it, surrounded by gauze and saline, her heart doing the one thing it never did at work. The judge granted it, Ruth said. With limits. But she granted it. Under the protective order the judge had set, Thomas's relevant medical records would be produced and reviewed first by the lawyers and the court, used only as the case required. It's not a guarantee, Ruth said carefully. We don't know what's in the file. Maybe there's nothing. But they can't keep it shut anymore. Elena stood in that closet and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 7 years. Across town, she would later learn, the news landed very differently. Thomas's lawyer requested a private meeting the same day. Carol called Ruth's office twice and was told politely that the attorney was unavailable. And for the first time, the people who had spent years deciding what was true about Elena's body went a little pale at the thought of a court deciding what was true about Thomas's. 8 days after the ruling, the folder arrived. Elena did not see it herself. She couldn't and she wouldn't. There are records no person has the right to touch, and she understood that boundary with the instinct of someone who had spent her career protecting the same boundary for others. The records went to Ruth through the proper channels, reviewed with the other side's attorney present, exactly as the judge had ordered. Then Ruth called and asked Elena to come to her office. She'd never asked that before. Elena knew before she sat down. Ruth had the careful face of someone about to hand you something heavy. 7 years ago, she said, Thomas went to a clinic in the city. The one you remembered. She slid a single page across the desk. Just one line visible, the rest sealed under the court's order. The diagnosis was a word Elena had written on charts 100 times. Azoospermia. No measurable sperm. Thomas had been told in plain clinical language, 7 years ago, that he could not father a biological child. The same week he came home moody and closed and quietly changed. The same weeks the whispers about Elena began. She sat very still. Ruth watched her the way you watch someone after you've delivered the scan results. Elena didn't cry. She didn't shout. She felt something enormous and quiet rearrange itself inside her, the way a bone feels when it finally goes back into joint. For 6 years, she had been the broken one, the hollow one, the shame of the Whitmore family, and the man who had let an entire town believe that. Had known the whole time. She drove home with the single page folded in her bag. She didn't turn on the radio. She had expected to feel triumphant. She'd braced for it, even worried about it, because she didn't want to become someone who finds happiness in another person's ruin. But triumph never came. What came instead was something stranger. Something sadder. Grief. Almost. 6 years of her life had been spent absorbing a wound that was never hers. Every pitying look at church. Every some women just aren't built for it. Every night she'd lain awake wondering what was wrong with her, what she'd failed to give, why her body had supposedly betrayed her marriage. All of it had been a story Thomas wrote to cover a truth he couldn't face about himself. He had handed his shame to her, and let her wear it in public for years. And his mother had pinned it on with both hands. She sat in her car in the lot outside her apartment, the way she always seemed to end up sitting in cars at the turning points of her life, and she said something out loud to no one. The same thing she had said to Carol in that hospital hallway. Is that what you believe? Only now she understood what she had been asking all along. And then a new question rose, one she couldn't push back down. If Thomas could not father a child 7 years ago, if the clinic was right, then the baby boy Carol had bragged about in that hospital hallway, the son Thomas was parading through the maternity ward, the child he had left Elena to go make with her best friend, could not be his. The arithmetic was brutal in its simplicity. A man with that diagnosis almost never fathers a child without treatment Thomas had never sought. Which left a contradiction too large to ignore. Either the clinic had been catastrophically wrong, or the baby everyone believed was Thomas Whitmore's son had been fathered by someone else entirely. And then Mara's midnight text, the one that had arrived out of nowhere after a year of silence, suddenly made horrible, perfect sense. Please don't do this. Think about the baby. Mara wasn't worried about a lawsuit hurting Thomas's feelings. She was worried about what a courtroom full of medical records might force out into the open. Because Mara knew something the rest of the town didn't. She knew whose baby it actually was. Elena called Ruth. I think there's more in the ground, she said. Ruth didn't pause. Then let's let the court find it. Not us. The court. The man who had walked into the hospital that day, the one Elena had mentioned at the very beginning of this story, had a name. Daniel Reyes. He was quiet by nature, by all accounts. A man who had been in Mara's life during the same month she had been falling into Thomas's orbit. When Mara had chosen Thomas, she had cut Daniel off completely, blocked his number, vanished from his world without explanation, never breathed a word about a due date or a hospital or a child. She had gambled he would disappear. That he would never connect the dots. But the timing hadn't sat right with him. And he had kept asking quiet questions to the few people they'd both known. That very morning, one of those people had let the hospital name and the date slip. So he came. And when he stepped through those automatic doors, when he walked into the room where Mara stood holding a child she had told everyone belonged to Thomas, all the color left her face. That is the picture to hold. Carol, smug and triumphant by the elevators. And 5 steps behind her, walking into the maternity room, the living proof that the perfect life had been built on the same kind of lie they had buried Elena under for years. Elena hadn't engineered that moment. She hadn't even understood it when it happened. She had only smiled at Carol, asked her quietly if that was really what she believed, and turned back toward the elevator. The door opened behind her. A stranger walked through it. And a whole house of lies began quietly coming down without Elena lifting a single hand. Thomas knew. That is the thing Elena kept coming back to. The thing that turned the whole story from sad to something close to unforgivable. He had known for 7 years. So when Mara became pregnant, he knew with absolute certainty the child was not biologically his. And he took that baby anyway. He stood in front of his mother and his church and his entire small world and let them believe he had finally made the son his barren first wife had failed to give him. He used a child that wasn't his as the final punctuation mark on a sentence he had spent years writing about Elena. The cruelty wasn't the affair, though that was bad enough. The cruelty was that he had looked at a baby he knew couldn't be his, and seen first and foremost a prop. Proof of a manhood he had quietly been terrified wasn't there. The final, cruel closing of a chapter he'd written entirely out of fear. Thomas's lawyer went quiet after the folder was reviewed. No more motions. No more fight. Just a request to discuss resolving the matter privately. Elena understood why. He wasn't afraid of losing the lawsuit anymore. He was afraid of what the lawsuit would say out loud, in front of everyone, about the son he'd been showing off at every church gathering and family dinner for months. Then Carol came to Elena's apartment. She appeared on a Sunday in her church clothes, and Elena almost didn't open the door. When she did, Carol looked older than she remembered. Smaller. She didn't apologize. Elena wants to be honest about that, because for a breath, she had thought she might. Instead, Carol asked, in a voice with a crack running through it, for Elena to drop everything. Not for Thomas, she said. For the family. For the baby. For the name. And as she spoke, Elena saw something she hadn't expected. She saw a woman who had been lied to by her own son for 7 years. A widow who had poured everything into one child and built her entire sense of self around the certainty that he was good. Carol hadn't spread those cruel words because she was evil. She had spread them because Thomas had handed them to her, polished and certain, and she had loved him too much to ever doubt him. For one breath, Elena felt something real for her. Then Carol said it again. The same line she had carried for years, except this time it came out as a plea instead of a proclamation. Some women just aren't built for it, Elena. Why drag everyone through the mud over it? And Elena understood that even now, even standing on the edge of the truth, Carol would rather protect the lie than release it. Sympathy is not the same as surrender. Carol, Elena said quietly, go home. The mud was never mine. Carol left without another word. And Elena closed the door. And didn't feel cruel. She felt finished. Thomas's lawyers offered a settlement. A quiet one. They'd pay a sum, issue a private retraction to the hospital board, clear her professional record. In exchange, she'd seal everything and never speak of it. Ruth laid the offer on the desk. It's a good deal on paper, she said carefully. You'd get your name back. The board would hear the truth. You could walk away with everything you came for. Elena thought about it for a long time. And then she said no. Not out of spite. Not because she wanted to watch Thomas burn. But because a private truth was just a quieter version of the same lie. For 6 years, they had said it about her out loud. In churches, at potlucks, in rooms full of people who believed them. The correction had to live in the same place. Not a whisper. Not a sealed drawer. The truth, said once, where it counted. In front of the same people who had believed the lie. I won't whisper an apology, she told Ruth, for a wound he handed me. Ruth capped her pen. Then we go to court, she said. Where something you can breathe in. The county courthouse on the morning of the hearing was cold and bright. Elena had expected to be nervous. She had run 1,000 codes without her hands shaking. But this felt different. Because this time, the thing on the table was her. The room filled in a way that told you everything about small towns. 2 members of the hospital board sat near the back. Several women from Carol's church circle, The same ones who had nodded along to the pity for years, filed into the middle rows. Carol herself was rigid in the second row. Thomas sat beside his lawyer, pale and sweating in a suit that no longer fit him right. Mara was near the back, holding herself very still. 2 rows behind her, quiet and present, sat Daniel Reyes. She could feel him there without turning around. Elena sat at Ruth's table and felt the whole architecture of the past 7 years gathered in one room. For 6 years, these people had been the audience to her humiliation. Now they were the audience to something else. Ruth didn't raise her voice once. That is what Elena remembers most. She built the case the way you build a diagnosis, one finding at a time, calm and unhurried, until the conclusion was the only one left standing. She established the statements, the dates, the witnesses. Carol's own words, repeated at potlucks and prayer circles. Some women just aren't built for it. She established the harm, the lost promotion, the salary, the documented damage to a career built with years of sacrifice. Then she turned to the defense's own claim, that the statements were true, that the infertility was Elena's, and she asked the court to consider the records the defense had forced into play by making that very argument. Under the protective order, only one line was read aloud. 7 years ago, Thomas Whitmore had been diagnosed with a condition that made fathering a biological child medically impossible. The room changed temperature. Elena watched the church women turn to look at Carol, who had gone the color of paper. Ruth noted, gently and without theater, that a related court proceeding involving the child's paternity had resulted in genetic testing that did not support Thomas's biological parenthood. She said it the way you read a lab value. Plainly. Without drama. And that was when Thomas stood up. That's not. His voice cracked across the room. You can't. The judge told him to sit. Carol was on her feet too, saying Elena's name like an accusation, saying it couldn't be true, saying Elena had twisted everything. The two of them, loud and unraveling, while Elena sat perfectly still and said nothing at all. Then Carol turned on her, the way drowning people grab at whatever is nearest. Her composure was gone. Her church supper certainty was cracked wide open. And out of the wreckage came the only words she had left. Some women just aren't built for it, she cried, pointing a shaking finger across the room. Some women just aren't. She couldn't finish it the second time. Elena stood up slowly, because she had waited 7 years, and she was not going to rush this. She didn't shout. She used the voice she uses when she has to tell a family something true and hard. The voice that is calmer than the room can stand. You're right, Carol. The whole courtroom went silent. You're exactly right. She let that sit. She looked at Thomas, then back at his mother. One person in this marriage was never built to have children. A breath. The file only ever had his name on it. Carol's hand dropped. Thomas had his face buried in his hands. The women from the church circle, the ones who had nodded along to her ruin for years, sat with the truth finally settling over them, rearranging everything they thought they'd known. Elena wasn't built wrong. She had never been built wrong. The man who had let an entire town believe otherwise was sitting 6 feet away, coming apart at the seams, while the calm woman he had called broken stood steady on her own 2 feet. She said it once. Out loud. Where it counted. And then she set it down. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way you might imagine. There was no shouting match. No dramatic exit. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse for the Whitmores because of it. Thomas didn't deny it again. He couldn't. He sat with his head down while his lawyer asked for a recess. When the judge granted it, he didn't get up. He stayed in his chair, hunched inside that ill-fitting suit, watching 7 years of careful storytelling collapse in a single morning. The church women filed out with their eyes down. Carol followed them, smaller than Elena had ever seen her. No longer a general. No longer certain of anything. Mara had slipped out during the recess. But Daniel had risen from his seat 2 rows back and walked out the same door close behind her. The question of that baby, the one nobody had been willing to ask honestly, was now headed somewhere it could finally be answered. Elena sat at the table and let it all empty out around her. Ruth put a hand on her shoulder. You did that without raising your voice, she said. I've been practicing law for 30 years. You'd be surprised how rare that is. In the weeks that followed, the measurable things arrived. Thomas's standing in the community, the thing he had protected at Elena's expense for years, simply evaporated. You cannot outrun a courthouse in a place that small. He left within a few months. Moved somewhere nobody knew the story yet. He had spent 7 years making sure everyone believed a lie about Elena. In the end, the truth didn't need her to chase him. It just needed to be said once in the right room. The hospital board chair called her in a few weeks after the hearing. He had the uncomfortable look of a man who had believed the wrong thing and knew it. He told her the department leadership position was open again. He told her the earlier concerns about her judgment and stability had been reviewed and found to be without foundation. He didn't quite apologize. But from a hospital board, close is about all you ever get. She took the job. Not because she needed to win one more thing, but because it had been hers, built with her own hands, her own years, and she was not going to let a lie keep it from her one day longer. Her first week running the department, she walked into the trauma bay and breathed in that clean cotton and antiseptic smell. It smelled different now. It didn't smell like a hiding place. It smelled like a thing she had earned and gotten back. She ran her first code as lead with her hands as steady as they had ever been. And afterward, standing at the sink washing up, she caught her own reflection in the dark window, and didn't recognize the exhaustion that used to live in her face. It was gone. She felt light. Like she had been carrying a bag of stones for 7 years without realizing the handle was right there. And someone had finally shown her she was allowed to put it down. Thomas left. Last she heard, he was somewhere out west, starting over among strangers. She doesn't wish him harm. She doesn't wish him much of anything. Which is its own kind of freedom. Carol lost the thing she'd built her entire identity around, not because Elena took it from her, but because the truth about her son was simply too large to keep out of a town that size. The women's circle she'd presided over for decades quietly moved on without her. She stopped going. Elena felt a small, real sadness about that. The sadness you feel for someone who chose the lie right up until it took everything. Mara and Daniel worked out the matter of the baby the proper way. Through the courts, the way it should be done. Elena hopes for that child's sake they found something steady on the other side of it. That little boy didn't ask for any of this. Mara and Elena never spoke again. Some friendships don't break. They just turn out never to have been what you thought. And you set them down with the rest. Elena kept the job. She kept the apartment. She kept the watch on her wrist. And she wrote one final thing before she closed this chapter. A short note to Carol. Not long. Not angry. She had thought about her standing in that doorway in her church clothes. A woman who had been lied to by her own son and had chosen the lie anyway. And she found she didn't want to carry anger toward her into the rest of her life. Anger is just one more bag of stones. I won't carry your son's lie anymore, she wrote. You shouldn't either. That was all. She didn't expect a reply. She didn't get one. But writing it closed something. That night, she slid her grandmother's watch off her wrist and held it in her palm for a long moment. Thinking about what her grandmother used to say. That patience isn't waiting. It's knowing the right moment when it comes. She had waited 7 years for the right moment. It had come. She had met it. And now the time that watch had been counting wasn't borrowed against some future reckoning anymore. It was just hers. The whole quiet rest of her life. Finally, entirely hers. If you take one thing from her story, one thing, let it be this. The truth doesn't shout. It doesn't chase. It doesn't beg to be believed. It just waits, patient as a ticking watch, for the day someone finally stops being afraid and asks the right question out loud. She was called broken for 6 years. And one quiet question in the right room brought the whole thing down. If you have ever been handed a wound that wasn't yours and told to wear it in public, put it down. Say your truth where it counts. And then walk away lighter than you arrived. By the way, where are you watching this story from right now? Drop it in the comments, because it moves something in me every time, seeing how far these stories travel. From a small town in Ohio all the way to wherever you are tonight. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And I'll see you in the next one.